Taxes never paid for anything. Debunking a favorite conservative fallacy which arrogant and ignorant conservatives will trot out in a moronic attempt to prevent any money being spent to liberate the people from mercantilist Democrats. By C.P. Clapper, author of Popular Capitalism and The Way Out, or How Electronic Revenue Credits Can End the Debt Crisis, Open Government, and Restart the Economy. Government expenditures were always made out of the public treasury. This has been the case even what was, for conservatives, the halcyon days of a barter economy, where their buddies who had cornered the market in every conceivable asset could dictate to princes and to ministers the terms for acquiring the assets to be traded for the implements of war. In this case, the governments borrowed gold to store in the treasury, and then paid for arms and soldiers out of that treasury. The conservatives have nonetheless managed to misread the Constitution to insert their economic ideology and claim that taxes in particular pay for certain expenses. Constitutional treatment. The Constitution in its revenue clauses is convoluted and therefore easily misunderstood. First, it stipulates in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1, that all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. The rest of Section 7 digresses into how bills become law through the signing by the President or after overriding a presidential veto. After it returns from that digression, it grants to Congress what appears to be revenue-raising powers in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, with a purpose attached to the whole of them, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Yet no mechanism is provided for that linkage to the raising of revenue, and certainly not to taxation in particular. Instead, receipts and expenditures are explicitly linked to the Treasury. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and accounts of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. That's from Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. Cousin Roger's book. In reviewing the literature for a longer treatment, I was surprised to see favorable references by conservatives to a book by my cousin Roger Sherman. This is surprising because our family, my paternal grandmother's maternal grandmother was Caroline Marie Cole, née Sherman, had been opposed to all forms of democracy for generations, and conservatives support democracy. I would have been pleasantly surprised if a book by my cousin Roger Sherman, signer of all 4 founding documents of the United States, caused the conservative democracy to renounce democracy. Alas, that was not the case, such flattery only serving the conservatives' democratic mercantilist ends. Critique of A Caveat Against Injustice. The book in question, A Caveat Against Injustice, was written by Cousin Roger after he lost a court case for questionable reasons which I agree were suspect. Much of the book is closely argued, but it is fundamentally flawed, being based on a false premise which is assumed by democratic mercantilists as conservatives today, and undoubtedly then. Since Cousin Roger is family, I have more authority to debunk his work than democratic mercantilists, conservatives, have in praising it to the hilt. Clearly, in the milieu of the British democratic mercantilist empire, which had overtaken the communist republican settlements, Cousin Roger fell in with a bad crowd. Critique of A Caveat Against Injustice continued. From page 30, section 4, suppose a man comes to a trader's shop in this colony to buy goods, and the trader sells him a certain quantity of goods and tells him the price is, whatever, to be paid at the expiration of 1 year from that time, and the man receives the goods. In other words, a worthless debt, an IOU, was taken in payment for goods. Page 30, Section 5, makes this error more explicit. Now I query what the creditor has a right to demand for a debt so contracted, or what the debtor can oblige him to accept in payment. The democratic mercantilist biases of the day accepted a worthless debt as a point of equity, of justice even, to which the rest of the economic system needs to be contorted. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Yet my illustrious cousin and his adulators on this matter among the conservatives do not recognize the gross error of accepting a debt, the IOU, for something of value. He could have avoided this injustice of debt by demanding cash payment at the point of sale, or bartering for an asset in return. What makes my cousin's specious argument sound so convincing is that the reliance of the mercantilist system upon debt for transactions is an article of faith in that system. Arrayed against the mercantilist superstition of magical debt value is the invention of money, which is a numeraire, deliberately having no intrinsic value, which is essential for a pure, hence fluctuating, medium of exchange. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Actual money is equitable because at the instant of exchange, it pays the stated price. What is inequitable is debt, indeed any long-term contract for exchange. An honest day's wage for an honest day's work is a proverb which underscores this immediacy of justice and its relation to money as a pure, fluctuating medium of exchange. Thus, the assertion in the subtitle that there are evils in a fluctuating medium of exchange is refuted. Instead, debt and other long-term contracts for exchange are proven to be evil. What of the other assertions in my cousin's book? We need to address them singly to ensure that the conservatives do not further abuse his good name in their cause. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. In Section 6, the trader has those rights, but he can enforce them himself. In Section 7, the purchaser can have no such expectation for his purchase in the trader's shop. The trader's shop, the trader's rules. The reasoning in Section 8 and 9 has been corrupted by the unnecessary creation of debt. Without it, the supposed obligations to pay debts in certain ways do not exist. The assertions of Section 10 are so deceptive and disingenuous as to require another heading. Critique of a caveat against injustice, countering the assertions of Section 10. The assertions of Section 10 are: bills of credit are of no intrinsic value, and their intrinsic value is fluctuating and very uncertain. That bills of credit are of no intrinsic value is an irrelevant attempt at a slur, not just of bills of credit, but of every form of money. It is irrelevant when there is no barter. Only the unjust interposition of debt into the exchange, an interposition which creates barter, requires an asset, a store of value, in order to restore justice to an exchange disrupted by the debt. Critique of a caveat against injustice, countering the assertions of Section 10, continued. However, not having intrinsic value is an extremely useful attribute of money. It allows money to fulfill its purpose as a pure medium of exchange, since it does not require a wasteful and confining asset purchase in order to complete a transaction. Indeed, not having an intrinsic value, being a numeraire, is the very definition of money and is at the heart of that invention. This irrelevant slur appeals to democratic mercantilists because it allows their people ruling into every exchange. Not least because democratic mercantilists and their conservative economist allies bring it up at this juncture, we must counter the pejorative expression of the observational law customarily attributed to Sir Thomas Gresham. Countering the pejorative expression of Gresham's law. Gresham's restatement of the ancient observational law was that, quote, bad, unquote, coins drive out, quote, good, unquote, coins, where goodness is measured by the value of the metals of which a coin is composed. This is frequently, incorrectly, and pejoratively stated as bad money drives out good by democratic mercantilists and their conservative economist allies. As we have just observed, the goodness of money is opposite of the goodness of coins and assets. A more frank extension of Gresham's law would be cheap currency drives out expensive. Species of money, currencies, are better the closer they approximate a pure medium exchange. Thus, Gresham's law, with recognition of the invention of money, would be that true money drives out assets masquerading as money, and that we should welcome it to reallocate assets. Critique of a caveat against injustice, countering the assertions of Section 10, continued. Therefore, the first assertion translates into bills of credit are true money. The second assertion, that the extrinsic value of bills of credit are fluctuating and very uncertain, is only half true, is misleading, and is stated in a pejorative manner. The extrinsic value of bills of credit fluctuate in the mid to long term. In the short term, however, an active and liquid market ensures that their extrinsic value remains stable. Moreover, the trader with a shop is able to set the prices of their goods based on a stable short-term value of bills of credit, telling the customer to take it or leave it. The value of what the trader with a shop receives in value at the point of exchange with those bills of credit is therefore very certain. The ability of the bills of credit to fluctuate their extrinsic value over time enabled them to be used as a medium of exchange, to adjust to market conditions for a plethora of goods and services, something which assets and currencies tied to assets are unable to do. Critique of a caveat against injustice, countering the assertions of Section 10, continued. Thus, rather than making transactions uncertain for a trader with a shop, as the second assertion falsely suggests, the type of fluctuations which bills of credit undergo, given the inherent control of a trader with a shop over the pricing of their goods, make their transactions more certain, since their pricing can be adjusted weekly according to the extrinsic value of bills of credit when the transaction is made. Therefore, a true and non-pejorative version of the second assertion would be that the extrinsic value of bills of exchange is flexible, thus facilitating their use as a medium of exchange. The conclusion drawn from these smears of bills of credit and of money in general, that it would be unjust that any person should be obliged to receive them in payment, is specious and false. Nobody, least of all the trader with a shop, is being obliged to receive them in payment for goods. The ancillary claim that money ought to be something of a certain value, it being that whereby other things are to be valued, is itself specious and false for purposes of exchange. Debunking the claim that money ought to be of something of a certain value. This gets to the heart of my cousin's error, for money is, or should be, a pure medium of exchange. As a pure medium of exchange, money should be a numeraire, like inches in the expression 6 inches, since this allows prices to express certain values at the point of sale of the exchange without being encumbered by the expense and complication of an asset being used in that transaction. What ought to be certain values are assets, since they are stores of value. Money as a medium of exchange ought to be of no value. Not zero value, but no value, precisely because it is that whereby other things are to be valued against each other. If one is engaged in a barter transaction, then one is not using money, but assets. A debt established at the point of sale is thus a contract which replaces a money transaction with a barter transaction. Therefore, debts used in the sale of goods and services require assets after that sale. Critique of a caveat against injustice, countering the assertions of Section 10, concluded. Therefore, the correct conclusion to be drawn would be that, quote, it would be unjust that any person should be obliged to receive a debt contract in lieu of immediate payment. Moreover, the trader might, in fact, be obliged to take those worthless IOUs by convention, such as is found in the expression, just bill me, or by the economic necessity of competing against other traders which do and have been profiting from inflation directed towards their goods and made good by repayment with assets of a certain value. So the real injustice felt by the trader is the taking of debt contracts for the deferred purchase of goods and services. My local tailor refuses to be subjected to that injustice, posting an "only cash" sign prominently on his door. Critique of a caveat against injustice, refuting Section 11. The assertions of Section 11, following the errors of Section 10, are that, quote, it is a principle that must be granted that no government has a right to impose on its subjects any foreign currency to be received in payments as money which is not of intrinsic value, and that if so imposed, it should assume and make good to the possessor of such currency the full value which they oblige him to receive it for. The first assertion extends the slurs of Section 10 to foreign currency through the presumed and erroneous validity of debt contracts in transactions. Without the slurs, the principle is much stricter. No government has a right to require its citizens to accept any foreign currency for their local transactions. In fact, the exchange of foreign currency for local currency moots any such requirement. Critique of a caveat against injustice, refuting Section 11, continued. Such exchanges preemptively ensure that a trader receives the full immediate value of cash payments for his local goods, for its goods and services, since they would then be made in the local currency. However, nothing can make debts valid, showing that the concerns of the second assertion are misplaced. Moreover, the second assertion is mooted by the same foreign currency exchanges which moot the first. The conclusion is that because in so doing they would oblige men in part to part with their estates for that which is worth nothing in itself and which they don't know will ever procure him anything. Not only is the conclusion mooted by the mooting of the premises in the assertions, but it is used to extend the slurs against money into outright fear-mongering. Critique of a caveat against injustice, refuting Section 11, continued. For even though there would be no such eventuality in a political economy with a foreign exchange, the claim that the trader, in selling his wares, is parting with his estate is hyperbolic. That currency is itself priceless does not mean that it is worthless. It has temporal value, else customers would not have received it. The goods and services of the trader are also temporal, being entered into a market, and therefore lack the permanence of an estate. It is therefore fitting that the ephemera of goods and services be exchanged for temporal value. Likewise, the certainty of procuring him anything with money is temporal, not a will ever. This confusion of the permanent with the temporal is part and parcel of the mercantilist mindset, where estates are transmuted from homes into mere commodities. Critique of a caveat against injustice, refuting Section 11, concluded. We might better ask why we tolerate mercantilism at all, since it subjects all which is near and dear to us to the auction block, imposing a frightening impermanence upon us. Again, we return to the matter of debt, which is the means of bringing our estates to the auction block, of confusing the permanent with the temporal, and of eliciting unreasoning fears of money. As with Section 10, sophistry intends to prohibit money and to reestablish barter through debt. As with Section 11, reason shows us that the true injustice is debt, from which money as a pure medium of exchange frees us. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Sections 12 and 13 show that the bills of credit for my cousin's case, those of Rhode Island and of Connecticut, were not the pure media of exchange posited in the previous sections, but instead the hybrid monsters of currency placed on an asset basis, such as, in this case, a silver standard. From such a hybrid instance flows the erroneous first statement of Section 14. And since the value of the bills of credit depend wholly on the rate at which they are stated on the credit of the government by whom they are emitted, we have already seen that this statement is wholly false, that the values of the bills of credit are wholly based on their supply and the markets in which they are used on any given moment. But what is the effect of imposing a wholly unnecessary asset standard, and particularly the rate and the credit of the government establishing that useless standard? Critique of a caveat against injustice, refuting Section 14. As with other currencies hamstrung by a useless asset standard, the effect of the rate and the credit of the issuing government, both individually and together, on the bills of credit is wholly on supply. As long as there is faith and credit in the issuing government, there will be no rush to exchange bills of credit for not very fungible and not very usable assets. In those rare cases where people want a capricious store of value in a rare earth, the rate will determine how much of the currency will be taken out of circulation to satisfy this demand. Then, to the degree that people foolishly base their use of money on the credit of the government issuing the money, to that degree they will be alarmed by a depletion of the Treasury's holdings of the assets which constitute the standard. Therefore, as long as the rate is too high in the setting, there will be a run on the Treasury, forcing a reduction in that rate to the point that the frantic crowd is satisfied or depressive parity is achieved. Critique of a caveat against injustice, refuting Section 14, continued. Expectations of further reductions can and will compound the problem, leading to further reductions in the rate, even beyond parity with the currency in circulation, until the money supply is perilously low and the economy and its market are in danger of sinking into barter. If some degree of public sanity is restored, a government can destroy it by issuing much more currency while still on the standard, whether to replenish the Treasury or to reopen government. The only sensible policy at this point is to go off the standard, issue money to liquidate sovereign debt, and to establish a regular charterless cycle to create, circulate, and destroy money. The second assertion is an unsubstantiated storyline used to imagine a reason for the standard. It makes more sense that each state established its own currency by fiat, and that trade determined the relative values among the various state currencies, just as it has throughout time. Critique of a caveat against injustice, refuting Section 14, concluded. Further, the reference to the public faith and credit of such government is to the standard rather than to the bills of credit, which are being smeared by this oblique and false reference. Therefore, the conclusion to be drawn by the violation of that public faith and credit is that the asset standard should be dropped, not the bills of credit should cease being currency. Such sophistic reasoning is the basis of my cousin's caveat and of the conservatives' arguments against actual money, for which they commandeer my cousin's early and deficient writings. The actual remedies to my cousin's case would then be to prohibit debts and asset standards, not the acceptance of both and the prohibition of actual money, in his case represented by bills of credit. We shall see that application as we proceed. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Following the sophistic reasoning of Section 14, Section 15 then asserts a principle which is at once specious and duplicitous, that the worthless IOU should be used to pervert true money. That a debtor ought not to pay any debts with less value than was contracted for without the consent or against the will of the creditor. The actual resolution to my cousin's case can be found in Section 16, and its statement that Rhode Island bills of credit stood stated equal to silver at 27 shillings an ounce at the point of sale. Therefore, the trader should have either conducted the trade in barter for ounces of silver equal to the price of shillings divided by 27, or have written a contract for that amount of silver. However, the rest of Section 16 states subsequent silver standards for Rhode Island bills of credit in bemoaning his unwise decision as a trader to take a worthless debt contract in payment. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Section 17 observes that a trader who has foolishly drawn up a contract for debt in payment of goods already received, and who has not explicitly written that contract for an amount of an asset, which is to say a store of value, but has instead depended on a fixed standard for any specie which might resemble the denomination of the debt in the desired asset, cannot possibly know the future basis amount of any such standard when that future standard is established by a future law. The rest of Section 17 exploits this cavalcade of errors by the trader to smear bills of credit and the proper use of true money, in order to force all transactions to be rendered as barter or barter equivalents, or to force bills of credit and by extension all money to be crippled by fixed asset standards, thereby serving the interests of mercantilists, usurers, and asset monopolists. The conclusions which should be drawn are currency should not be crippled by asset standards, and the cash payment in such true money should be made at the point of sale for all transactions. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. However, such conclusions would prevent the democratic mercantilists from exerting control. The conservatives, being Democrats, exploit the false conclusions of Section 17, thereby abusing my cousin's good name to advance their own people ruling or democratic interests. True reason applied to the foregoing would come to a different conclusion in Section 18, so that instead of suggestively arguing that the arguments drawn from custom are of no force because the reasons upon which the custom was grounded do now cease, the stronger and explicit conclusion would be made that traders should not be obliged to accept debt in payment of received goods and services, because debt is a worthless IOU, and the terms of debt contracts denominated in currency are necessarily capricious. Instead, traders have every right to demand payment in local currency at the point of sale, or POS, or failing that, may demand payment in asset acceptable to the trader, either at the POS or, if not bartered, in an explicit asset contract. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. The non-barter asset valued option can be accommodated by a non-money currency, such as a bearer demand silver certificate, with the proviso that the amount of silver is expressed in ounces or parts of an ounce of silver, rather than the indeterminate basis of shillings or whatnot. A certificate stating rendered to the bearer on demand 1/27th of an ounce of silver would have served the purposes of my cousin's case in place of each shilling he expected. The issuing authority would be expected to hold 1/27th of an ounce of silver for each certificate. It cannot be emphasized enough that such certificates are not money, but assets. The non-barter contract can then be denominated in the non-money currency through the trader, though the trader should set a due-by date on that contract to prevent a debt being established. While such accommodation may resolve disputes such as my cousin's, the use of such currencies and contracts are poor public policy, as they avoid the invention of money and its benefits. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. In section 19, my cousins, and by their adoption of his erroneous arguments, the conservative's ignorance of money, is exposed through his misuse of the word currency, an error perpetuated through dictionaries whose authors accepted that error without considering the etymology of currency. For if wide acceptance of a specie was what defined it being a currency, then we should more directly call it a prevalency, as its meaning in English is widely accepted, and its Latin etymology suggests prior value. However, currency is derived from the Latin verb currere, meaning to run, the racing analogy being elaborated by saying that a currency circulates, meaning to move in a circle, as on a track. Thus, a currency is a specie which moves quickly, its wide use being the consequence of its speed in exchange, rather than the other way around. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Thus, if anything has a value which is intrinsical and invariable, then that thing cannot be a currency, for the need of intermediating that value inhibits and delays exchanges. By the same token, such a thing, which is in fact an asset, is not a suitable medium of exchange. However, such a thing would be a suitable standard asset to be accepted in payment for debts where there is no special agreement for any species. The attempt in section 19 to coerce currency as a species into the role of collector of a worthless IOU is a fatuous attempt to smear true money and currency in general, and bills of credit in particular. The smear against bills of credit is continued in section 20, which makes an appeal to the laws of God and man, after first misrepresenting the role of a medium of exchange, as has been done throughout this diatribe, and then ignoring the many scriptural injunctions against debt. There is no reason that a medium of exchange should make debts good, and good reason that it should not. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Section 21 takes valid concerns about counterfeiting and perverts them to the cause of the barter economy, which serves the vested interests of asset monopolists. Even if the clippings and filings are not used to create counterfeit coins by counterfeiters, but by the state, such defacement of the coinage undermines the integrity of the coins as its charters. If the clippings and filings are a theft of the content of the coinage, then that crime should be charged at the first attempt to pass the defaced coins as currency and the coins seized. If the prosecution is difficult, as it well may be, then that difficulty should argue against using any precious metal in coins, instead using marked bills of credit. This is the exact opposite of what conservatives and what my cousin Roger urged. In section 22, the fallacies of the previous sections are combined to urge in effect a barter economy wholly beholden to those who have cornered the market in silver and gold. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Section 23, properly viewed, would be a condemnation of debts and of the complex devices used to make good on those worthless IOUs. Instead, it is used to smear bills of credit. Section 24 makes the smear in Section 23 more explicit, arguing that bills of credit should not be used as legal tender in payment of money for debts, when a sound reasoning would argue that only bills of credit and other forms of true money should be used as money in the payment for goods and services at the point of sale, while debts should be prohibited. Section 25 relates the smear to my cousin's case, when he should have demanded payment at the point of sale in Connecticut bills of credit, or if a barter transaction was his preference, in silver. Sections 26 to 30 go into the weeds of differing asset standards over time and place, in a vain attempt to redirect the blame for debts to true money. However, Section 30 introduces another type of smear against bills of credit and true money. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Section 30 falsely claims that the exchanges of a trader involve his permanent estate. In fact, the trader is dealing entirely with his disposable funds, which are as ephemeral as money. For if the trader has purchased any product for resale or raw materials to craft into a new item to be placed on the shelves of his shop, he is speculating on the future value of those products, so that the risk of that speculation can only come from disposable funds, not from his estate. To further imperil that investment by accepting debts for delivered products would be completely irresponsible if the investment actually came from his estate. It is not the duty of any state to protect the speculator from his losses, and even though it is reasonable for the state to be prohibited from cavalierly substituting a contractual obligation with a lesser obligation or none, it is by no means reasonable for a state to make a bad bet win. It can even be said that the state should not require a trader to accept an IOU in place of cash at sale. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. For any market, even one conducted in a shop, is built on contractual obligations of one accepted form. You take an item, you pay for it, then and there, in cash. Trying to force a trader to take a debt, an IOU, impairs the obligations of those market contracts. In all likelihood, the bar tab, the invoice, or any other form of debt will never be paid. Yet we are supposed to accept those worthless IOUs as valid contracts. A state which consistently adheres to the prohibition against impairing the obligations of contracts would be a no-debt state. In sections 31 and 32, this fear-mongering is raised to fever pitch, making people hysterical about money, not debt, causing them to lose their homes and appurtenances. In section 33, the absurdity of holding on to an ephemeral instrument as if it were an ungainly asset, totally unsuitable for use as a medium of exchange, is advanced as an excuse for tying currency to cornered assets as an anchor to sink the public market, while lining the pockets of the mercantilist monopolists. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. In an editorial footnote to section 33, the same fallacies which line the pockets of the mercantilist monopolists in my cousin's day is falsely taken by the conservatives who defend their interests today to be an accurate description of today's dilemma, in quotes. The federal government and its role of the government of currency is falsely alleged by these conservatives to be borrowing from the people, when the pernicious and unnecessary practice of sovereign debt consists of borrowing from today's mercantilist monopolists. Then those mercantilist monopolists, posing as the quote, the people, unquote, are falsely alleged to refuse to extend further loans, an allegation immediately refuted by the near zero interest rates on the debt instruments. Undeterred by logic, the conservatives proceed with their duplicitous argument, falsely claiming that the federal government is compelled to create actual money, which they place in quotes, when that money should have been the first action taken, and the creation of obligations to mercantilist monopolists avoided. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. In section 34, a democratic and absurd appeal is made to the plight of widows and orphans through estates. First of all, those widows and orphans which command our empathy are poor, not having estates. Second, anybody with an estate would be a fool to place it rather than its produce on the market. Third, the most secure holding of an estate would be collectively by a college of extended families, so that the widows and orphans would be mere members of that larger, nurturing entity. Therefore, widows and orphans, as well as the other members of their college, would be more secure, not less, by a system of pure money for a medium of exchange, since they can be given a stipend in that form, which assures their place in their respective colleges of extended families with a regular income, so that each college can then provide their necessities directly through the payment of college members for their labor and through the payment for any external supplies or equipment for collegial farming. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Section 34 continues with the false claim that the court must remedy the willing acceptance of worthless debt in the form of an unpaid invoice by the trader, and that it should do so by turning the system of money as legal tender into a barbaric system of barter using quasi-assets. The reasonable remedy of the deception of not paying for goods on the spot with actual money would be the return of undamaged and unconsumed goods by the customer to the trader and the outlawing of debt. If the people of a state wish to descend into barbarism by returning to a barter system, then their legislature can create quasi-assets denominated not in terms of money proper, but in ounces of the said asset, for example, silver, with the state holding the requisite ounces of that asset available for exchange on demand. In all cases, the establishment of actual money as a charter of the state should remain unperturbed, and, ignoring the hysterical rhetoric of democratic mercantilists and conservatives, unmaligned. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. In an editorial footnote to Section 34, the conservative editors falsely claim that Article 1, Section 10, Paragraph 1 created a general injunction against bills of credit as an act of the Assembly. In fact, that paragraph reads, "No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin and tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility." Whereas many of these actions are explicitly forbidden in Article 1, Section 9, but no such prohibition is stated for emitting bills of credit, it is clear that this prohibition of the states emitting bills of credit was a restriction of state powers, not a general prohibition sought by the conservatives. Indeed, Congress is given the power to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. Bills of credit as securities would thus be protected by counterfeit laws and are therefore authorized at the federal level. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. In Section 35, my cousin notes that only bills of credit issued by the government of currency for a state should be accepted in payment of taxes for that state. That is widely accepted principle of chartalism, essential to the management of the chartalist money supply where taxes are used. He therefore makes my case that money created by a state should be established as a medium of exchange and currency of record for taxes in that state, without being encumbered by assets or any store of value. Any protestations that the declared legal tender of a sovereign state ought only to be accepted as such in its own state would apply, even if its external value be depreciated to nearly nothing. Therefore, the same conclusion should be drawn even if the circumstances were reversed. The injustice thus has nothing to do with bills of credit, but instead with debts, specifically unpaid invoices. Quote, £1,000 of old tenor currency should be accepted as payment on an invoice for a £1,000 bill of cost, even if of less value than 20 shillings of bills of credit from a neighboring state, is the way that I would rephrase that. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. In Section 36, my cousin notes that only legal tender by a government of currency for a state should be accepted in payment of wages or fees in that state, without any restrictions or encumbrances. The statement reiterates the chartalist view and mine that a state establishes legal tender as a medium of exchange and currency of record for that state, without being encumbered by assets or any store of value. It is also a direct contradiction of the conservative view that pure money is always evil. The argument in Section 37 is duplicitous in that bills of credit of the neighboring state were received in good faith as payment at the point of sale, and that the key circumstance altered was not the external value of those bills of credit, but that a worthless IOU debt was accepted instead as payment. Sections 38 and 39 cite irrelevant details about unnecessary asset standards for currencies, which I have already debunked thoroughly in my critique of sections 19 through 30. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. In section 40, my cousin again makes the false claim that money should be a store of value instead of the medium of exchange, which I have conclusively proven it to be from the beginning of this critique. To put the matter more simply, the fair relative valuation of goods in a fluid market requires a currency capable of adjusting to market changes in relative value. If somebody wants a store of absolute value for them, there being no possible standard of absolute value for everybody, then they need to pick an asset they accept as their own personal standard and, Midas-like, convert their holdings, both currency and other assets, into that asset. The arbitrage cited in section 40 can easily be defeated through currency exchanges and the requirement to pay for goods at the point of sale in true local money. Again, I must reiterate that the gross injustice is in allowing debt through unpaid invoices on accounts, which is cited fatuously in section 41, where the blame is shifted from debt to true money. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. In section 42, my cousin finally makes a valid statement upon which all can agree. Only the currency of the government of currency for a state should be used as legal tender for that state. However, the way in which the currency clauses of the Constitution were implemented created many difficulties and unnecessary arbitrage between high-price and low-price regions of the Union. These could have been avoided if Congress had rejected conservatism and instead fulfilled its duty to regulate currency for the states in the Union, engraving and minting the currency for each state instead of engraving and minting just one set of federal currency. In section 43, my cousin returns to falsely giving credence to debts and debt contracts. The only fair policy consistent with a money-based market economy is to prohibit all debts and require payment in full in local currency at the point of sale. Section 44 expresses the notion of legal tender enveloped in the phrase old tenor of my cousin's day. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Having thoroughly debunked the premise of section 45, we can dispense with its question. In its place, we have already substituted a valid concern, the acceptance of debt at the point of sale. Likewise, we have already substituted the remedy for the actual evil in more explicit terms than in section 46, namely the abolition of debt. The conservative editors then claim in a footnote to section 46 that the removal of their presumed evil of paper money, Article 1, Section 10, Paragraph 1, forbidding the states to emit bills of credit, removed also what they see as the evil effect of that so-called evil. However, in their forward, and particularly in the quote from conservative ideologue Merrill Jenkins Sr., the remedy is found in the clause following that prohibition in Paragraph 1, namely the structure against the states making anything but gold and silver a tender in payment of debts. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. Indeed, in that same quote, Mr. Jenkins admits his objective. Quote, people are able to barter with gold and silver, coin, control government, and are free, end quote. In other words, the mercantilist monopolists who have cornered the market in the stylized assets used in this barter system are able to control the government and thus the people's economy. Therefore, the people able to barter with gold and silver coin are free at the expense of those who are not. The creditors are free, while the debtors are enslaved. The consequences cited as beneficial sound suspiciously like the modern serfdom. Our trade has advanced 50%, and the wealthy, the quote, moneyed people, quote, unquote, quote, can trust their cash abroad, end quote. In like manner, national retail store chains gain a huge burst in revenue from, quote, credit card, unquote, debt used at the point of sale, while the billionaire owners of those chains can frolic abroad. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. There can be no more precise statement of the conservatives' antipathy toward true money, toward currency with no intrinsic value which would facilitate its use as a medium of exchange, than to note how the lack of such true money forces the poor into an invoice or credit card debt which inflates the prices of the goods they are sold, with the shame of bankruptcy their only, quote, escape, end quote. The prohibition against debt was something my cousin's friend Thomas Jefferson deeply regretted not including in Article 1, Section 10, Paragraph 1, and perhaps he had a sense of the grave injustice which debt imposes on the poor. Rather than prohibiting paper money for the payment of debts, what should have been prohibited were the debts themselves, since they are the grave injustice. Equipped with true money, Congress would then be able to promote the general welfare by establishing a stipend for the citizenry, thus freeing them from the tyranny of mercantilist democracies. Critique of the caveat against injustice continued. The citizen endowment proposed by Thomas Paine showed that promoting the general welfare was a serious objective of the Constitution, as stated in its preamble. The conservative democratic mercantilist resistance against that idea, and ones like it, throughout our history are at the heart of the conservative virulent opposition to true money. In their snide footnote to the question posed in Section 47 as to what would be our medium of exchange without bills of credit, the foregoing has conclusively proved that the conservatives are the ignorant ones, not the ones posing the question then or today. Section 48 shows that my cousin was influenced too much by the British democratic mercantilist milieu of his day, in that he sees the cause of the wealthy as good enough to hold a suicidal position. He then qualifies that potential suicide by noting that the land provides the necessities, failing to recognize that the poor are landless and thus require an endowment or a stipend in true money to access them. Critique of a caveat against injustice continued. The claim in Section 49 that bills of credit are somehow a cheat rather than invoice debt has already been debunked above, and his deduction upon that false premise is scurrilous, adopted by conservatives as a smear against true money to this day. In Sections 50 and 51, my cousin pivots to the question of producing goods at home, in which supporters of true money and truly free markets concur. In popular capitalism, I present a new framework for interstate commerce, money and commerce, which properly addresses his concerns using true money and not barter. In that same work, I propose a system of true money and markets which implements David Ricardo's thesis of comparative advantage, without recourse to the formalized debts, which were the medium of trade for the British Democratic Mercantilist Empire and the other European Democratic Mercantilist empires, both during the time of my cousin's caveat and for over a century afterward. Section 52 thus betrays the untoward influence of my cousin's mercantilist neighbors on his view of trade. Critique of the caveat against injustice concluded. For the acquisition of gold and silver is no more necessary for a medium of exchange in foreign markets than it is for a medium of exchange in domestic markets. This plain statement debunks Section 52. Section 53 is a call for the Connecticut legislature to ban the use of Rhode Island and New Hampshire bills of credit as legal tender in Connecticut after the brief period for transition proposed in Section 54. It would have been far more sensible to require the use of Connecticut bills and to establish currency exchanges to facilitate conversion of the currency of other states into Connecticut currency. Section 55 is a prescient call for liquor prohibition, made specific to Rome, and we well know how that goes. The root cause of the excessive use of alcohol and drugs is beaming poverty. Yet dealing with that is precluded by conservatives, by democratic mercantilists, because they benefit from keeping people poor. Section 56 is an overly optimistic assessment of his own work by my cousin. The sycophantic conservative applauds this arrogance because it suits his own. My paternal heritage relative to fiscal economics. Whereas my paternal grandmother gives me my heritage relative to Republican compromise through Roger Sherman, the author of the Sherman Compromise, my paternal grandfather's parents were Jews from Galicia, a crown province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which included parts of modern-day Poland, the area from which one of my boyhood Revolutionary War heroes hailed, Haym Salomon. A Polish Jew who immigrated to the Americas just before the American Revolution, Haym Salomon provided key funding to the revolutionary cause, especially to enable George Washington to march his troops south to Yorktown, Virginia, to defeat Cornwallis there. What Salomon did was to convert the non-performing debt held by Robert Morris into ready cash, using bills of exchange. In other words, Robert Morris was in the role of my cousin and the trader in the caveat. French merchants paid for American goods delivered by Morris with worthless IOUs, but were convinced to make good on their purchases by accepting checks on what they owed as payment for their goods. My paternal heritage relative to fiscal economics concluded. The bills of exchange were those checks and constituted a form of money redeeming worthless debt. Similarly, the electronic revenue credits, ERCs, in my proposal in the way out, constitute bills of exchange, intermediated by the Federal Reserve in the role of central bank, creating actual money with ledger money to redeem worthless sovereign debt and exchanging that ledger money for draws on future revenue in the account of the United States Treasury. If that description of ERCs is too concise and confusing, you will find a more complete description in The Way Out, which you will find comparable to Haym Salomon's ingenious bills of exchange. My boyhood reading about Salomon's bills of exchange were, in fact, the inspiration for my ERCs. That Haym Salomon was, as an East European Jew, a fellow countryman through my paternal grandfather's roots, shows that he and his bills of exchange, which inspired my ERCs, and not cousin Roger Sherman and his caveat, constitute my paternal heritage relative to fiscal economics. The revenue from taxes can be used to buy back ERCs. Once implemented, my proposal in The Way Out can give a new role for tax revenue, similar to its chartless role of destroying money, buying back electronic revenue credits. When the Treasury sells ERCs to the Federal Reserve, ledger money can be created by that central bank. It might not need to do so, as I explained in the book, to increase the account balance of the Treasury. That increased balance becomes money when the Treasury spends out of that account. If that induces a general inflation, then tax revenue increases at current tax rates. This allows the Treasury to buy ERCs back from the Federal Reserve out of its accounts there. Thus, ERCs facilitate a new way for taxes to destroy money, following the chartless model. We now return to the traditional role of taxes. Taxes were sometimes used to replenish the Treasury. Obviously, this was mostly in the barter economy days. In this charterless era, there is no need to replenish the Treasury with assets. If the Treasury is replenished with currency, that is more a matter of logistical convenience, to stockpile currency for its later conversion into money after expenditure. If taxes are replenishing the Treasury with assets to foolishly maintain some standard, they are still not being used to pay government expenditures. Still, in all cases, taxes are never used to pay for anything. Instead, taxes are used to limit the money supply, while the Treasury is paying for public expenditures. Debts are paid out of the Treasury. Another stupid comment made by conservatives is the ridiculous claim that taxes pay our sovereign debt. If that were the case, the tax checks would be made out to the holder of the federal debt. They are in fact made out to the Internal Revenue Service, which then deposits them into the account of the Treasury. It is only once any revenue is placed in the Treasury that it is used to pay federal debts or make any other expenditure. The federal debt and deficit are different. The sheer stupidity of conservatives becomes even more apparent when they conflate the deficit with the debt. The deficit is the net paying out from the Treasury on any particular day. It pays for itself by expanding the money supply. The debt is a separate obligation of the federal government, which can be paid with a federal deficit. I give a systematic description of this process to eliminate the federal debt in The Way Out. The revenue from taxes reduces the money supply. That is the one and only purpose of taxes in a country's accounts. Most conservatives are extremely gullible, as is shown from their insistence on believing the lie that taxes pay for anything. That lie serves the vested interests of mercantilist Democrats and monopolists because, like a gold standard, it allows them to seize control of the sovereign right of the country to create money for the smooth operation of that country's economy. When mercantilist Democrats, the lords of employment, and monopolists control the country's economy, they control the country itself. The conservative rank and file dupes. Thus, the members of the conservative rank and file serve as dupes and an advance guard for the Democratic elite and its design on absolute power. It will only be when the conservatives realize their own need for a liberating stipend that they will rue the day they denied it to others, under the falsest of pretenses, thereby ensuring their own serfdom. It will be a consummate irony when they discover too late that conservatism is the road to serfdom, and that Hayek led them down a primrose path which masks the pernicious nature of that road. The end of ignorance.